Well, as a few other people come on in, we'll go ahead and get started. Um, and even though we probably know each other here, I'm going to go ahead and just do a formal introduction, just to honor our guest speaker. As Executive Director of the Office of Research and Grants, I'm honored to host the sabbatical presentation today. It's the final one for this academic year, and it features, of course, Dr. Kathryn Ecklund. The presentation is being recorded for the ORG, posting on the ORG YouTube channel, and a link will be put into the chat area if you're interested in seeing that. Dr. Ecklund is chair and professor of APU's Department of Psychology. She earned her BA in psychology and MA in clinical psychology from Biola, and then went on to earn her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Biola's Rosemead School of Psychology. She's been at APU since 2008, after having worked in different settings that include teaching and/or clinical roles at George Fox University, University Pacific, UC Davis School of Medicine, and the California State University at Sacramento. Dr. Ecklund is an accomplished scholar with multiple publications, including a noteworthy book, Cultural Psychology and Christian Diversity, Developing Cultural Competence for a Diverse Christian Community. And that came out in 2016 through Abilene Christian University Press. That's all 562 pages and 2.4 pounds of print. That's what Amazon said it weighed. She has pages of both invited and contributed presentations included in her CV, and many of them are in the area of multicultural competency. And not to be overlooked is that throughout her academic career, she's maintained clinical credentials and an active practice. Among professional achievements that Dr. Ecklund is particularly satisfied with is the development of excellent and innovative programs in the psychology department, done through close collaboration, and she emphasizes close collaboration with her department colleagues. And all agree that seeing those students matriculate through the programs that they've developed there and leave APU having accomplished their goals brings true blessings. And while she has a large professional presence, Dr. Ecklund refers to herself as the quote, her quotes, little one at home, given her two 6-foot sons, ages 16 and 22, who tower over her, of whom she is understandably very proud. And today, Dr. Ecklund's presentation is titled Revisioning Diversity Capacity Development. Dr. Ecklund.
Thank you, Don. By the way, I don't call myself the little one. My boys call me the little one. So when you talk about being home during COVID with the little ones, that's me. You also didn't mention my midlife crisis. So this year, my youngest became officially faster than me in downhill skiing. So I have entered a midlife crisis because I've always been better than them at that. So working that through in my personal therapy. So, all right, well, thank you for being here. It's very nice of you to come right before finals. I know we're all super busy. What I wanted to share today is a little bit about the project that I worked on during my sabbatical, which I've labeled this talk revisioning. Oh, I need to screen share, Dawn. Can I have screen share?
What's that?
Can I have screen share?
You have to make her co-host. Who's the host?
Yvonne.
No, anybody is able to share the screen.
Okay, so screen share.
I have it automatically set up in my settings.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see my talk?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, sorry about that. All right, now we'll get going. So we're talking about revisioning diversity capacity development. So I thought I would start with sharing kind of the journey to this project. As Don mentioned, my book came out in 2016, and that was a multi-year project The idea for it came to me when I returned to Christian higher ed, came back to APU after being in secular university or public university settings for several years, and have taught multicultural, done scholarship in multicultural my whole career. And having been out of Christian higher ed for a decade, coming back into it, got me really energized about the fact that I believe there's so much more we can do in advancing diversity and diverse communities as Christians. And so I undertook creating this writing project. But if you ever venture to try to read all of it, you may notice that I didn't really introduce the topic of injustice as a focus until towards the end of the book. And that was a really deliberate decision that I had made at the time, because I know that talking about multicultural diversity, talking about diversity can be very challenging. People can get anxious and threatened by conversations about differences, and in particular, conversations about justice can really get people, kind of on the defensive. So I left that towards the end of the book, and in the last few chapters undertook talking about justice a little bit, just to introduce the importance of addressing issues of justice in creating diverse communities, but didn't really make it a main focus, because the book was really written as a textbook for use with undergraduate students who are really at the beginning stages of their journey of multiculturalism. And so kind of walk them through diversity in general and developing diversity competence, and then kind of pepper that in as the next stage of their journey. So as a deliberate decision to try to decrease guardedness in the process of working through that book, it was a decision that I had made. Around the same time the book came out, I was privileged to participate in a research trip to South Africa with several of our colleagues who are pictured there. Those who've been around should recognize pretty much everybody. But a group of us went down to South Africa to study post-apartheid impact of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that occurred down there after apartheid, and was mandated, or was created by Nelson Mandela, but then was overseen by Desmond Tutu. And so we did a lot of reading and studying before we left about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then we met with scholars down there who were part of that process. So John Jansen and John Balmink, Neil Henry, who many of you guys may know from here. He's been to our campus from our South Africa campus, and Glenda Witschut. And so these people are all considered post-apartheid leaders in South Africa, and they all lived through apartheid and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and are currently there during post-apartheid. And so we went down there, we interviewed them, we had interdisciplinary dialogue. So all of us who went came from different parts of the university and engaged in dialogue both before the trip and then during the trip after each interview. Those are just a few of the people we interviewed, but those were, for me, the highlights. And had these great conversations about reconciliation and restorative justice, both in terms of it as a concept and in action. And this trip initiated a journey for me to really begin to engage in my own scholarship and teaching and training the concepts of reconciliation, restoration, and justice. So my sabbatical project was to begin to develop a manuscript for a book that revisions how we talk about diversity. This is the description that was sent out by email. Most of you probably know that historically multicultural diversity has been kind of conceptualized through Sue and Sue's lens of awareness and attitudes, knowledge and skills, and under the concept of cultural competency. So we use this word cultural competency, and we talk about it in terms of developing specific attitudes and awareness, specific knowledge and skills. And for 3 decades, this model has really pervaded many disciplines when you start talking about diversity. It's psychology for sure, but other disciplines has also used this model to kind of conceptualize how do we become better at doing diversity in our professions. So what I'm going to do is talk about how I started to look at revisioning it, and the way that I've done that is in part from this experience of this research trip in South Africa. We talked about it not just interdisciplinarily, but also in terms of as Christians. And so as I've undergone the process of trying to flesh out a new way of talking about it, it has been grounded in the Christian tradition. So before I jump into the revision, I want to talk about why I felt like a need to revision it. So awareness and attitudes, in the historical models of diversity competence, we've talked about the need to develop specific awareness and attitudes. And to do this, we've traditionally focused on things like cross-cultural exposure, expanding our social awareness, doing a lot of self-evaluation of our internalized biases and biased beliefs. More recently, this domain of cultural competence has started to incorporate focus on implicit or unconscious biases. And what I have noticed is as we, before implicit and unconscious biases were part of the dialogue, even just talking about internalized biases, it becomes challenging. People have a difficult time really having conversations about biases that have been internalized through life and social context. And so then when we more recently added this idea of unconscious implicit biases, the tension and the conflict that I've seen around people being asked to unpack their internal world has really gone up, because they're being asked to acknowledge biases that they don't believe they hold, and they're being told they're unconscious, they're implicit, and so it creates a really kind of threatening context for conversation. So that has, I think, made the conversations and the trainings around diversity competence particularly more challenging. Traditionally, the knowledge domain has focused on siloed knowledge acquisition. So I remember back in the 90s when this was really emerging, you could pick up Monica McGoldrick's textbook on ethnicity and family therapy. And there's like 74 chapters of, it's bigger than my book, by the way, 74 chapters of, how to do family therapy with 74 different ethnic family groups. So very siloed knowledge acquisition focused. And then also working knowledge was really siloed identity formation. Talking about yourself as a person of your race, or as a person of your gender, or as a person of your sexual identity. And so this model of knowledge acquisition created a demand for knowledge acquisition that exceeds any one person's ability to acquire it. And so there was an acknowledgement that knowledge is far more extensive than we can ever grow to have in this model of diversity competence. And then more recently, diversity has begun to evolve to incorporate things like intersectionality of identity. Now we don't see ourselves as just a person of our race or just a person of our gender, but a person of our race, gender, ethnicity, sexual identity, faith identity. We have multiple identities that intersect in our identity construct, which has created greater complexity to understanding the knowledge. Like it multiplies the complexity, which I think has been very good for us, but I think it also has just created a challenge because you have this push to learn all this stuff, and now we've added a whole other area called intersectionality to the knowledge mix. So it gets a little overwhelming. This model of, oh my gosh, there's no way that I'm gonna be able to become competent in the knowledge of diversity. And then the skills, ironically, because knowledge and awareness are so huge to unpack, skills has often kind of gotten short end of the stick on this model. And so we often don't talk much about skills in courses or trainings or in dialogue, because the first two areas, awareness and knowledge, are still all consuming. When skills are incorporated in this traditional model, it tended to focus on interpersonal relationship engagement and failed to incorporate dynamics of power differences in relationship dynamics. And justice was completely left out of the dialogue in this model. There is no dialogue about justice. Equity is part of that dialogue, but it often gets caught up on conflicting conceptualizations of what is equity. Is equity equality? Is equity equal outcomes? Just lots of conflict around how do we even define equity. And so this historical model, I think, while was a fabulous place to start, I feel like it's kind of got its limitations that makes it difficult to move forward into our current dynamic. And so so one of the things that I have been growing uncomfortable with, in addition to that model, is just even the term competence, diversity competence. And so, this is one of those areas where the more you know, the more you know you don't know. The more skills you develop, the more you realize how unskilled you are. And so the concept of competence assumes a baseline mastery. In our professions, it's a professional baseline mastery, right? And it's very difficult for people who are working in this area to ever feel like they've mastered it. And so I've been uncomfortable with the concept of competence, and then have begun to see us kind of bumping up against the limits of the Sue and Sue model. And so I've wanted to introduce this concept of cultural capacity, that we work in multiculturalism to expand our cultural capacity. So this is just a term I have coined. I haven't seen it out there. And I've defined it as one's understanding of and skills in effectively engaging in relationships, personal or professional, with others that produce desired outcomes while navigating complex interpersonal dynamics, aware of and attuned to the dynamics of diversity as they are imposed onto and experienced within relationships. So that's a working definition that I'm working with. And this model here talks about cultural capacity as being made up of these three core concepts: cultural humility, reconciliation and restorative justice in relationships, and then systemic and social restorative justice. So humility, reconciliation, restorative justice at both the interpersonal and the systemic level. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit. I'll just introduce you a little bit to that each day through this hour. As I wanted to make this transition, I needed to really dig into the literature, because much of the literature is still grounded in that old Sue and Sue model. And so I needed to really break out and expand into what is out there, what is being said about diversity now, and kind of extend a little bit further out, not just in the area of clinical psychology, but other areas of psychology and other disciplines as well. During that time of exploring the literature, I stumbled across a model of psychotherapy and had this huge aha moment. So as a clinical psychologist, when people ask me, what kind of therapy do you do? I have this long, convoluted answer, because my thinking about human needs and human healing never really fit well into one model. So I would kind of start with ecosystems and kind of talk about individual and then family and then multi-systems and kind of give a long, convoluted answer. And then I stumbled across relational cultural theory during my sabbatical. Fabulous model. And it was a aha moment. It's like, oh my gosh, this is the way I think. Somebody's written it down. And so I dug into this model, give you a brief overview of it, because the work that I'm doing with this manuscript is grounded in two things. It's grounded in the Christian tradition, and then it's also grounded in this model. Relational cultural theory asserts that human psychology is driven by desire for relational connection. That connection is the primary organizing factor that organizes our growth and development across the lifespan, and that we're driven to seek mutuality, authenticity, and vulnerability in our relationships. Now, traditional, and because I know my colleagues are here, I'm not saying traditional psychodynamic, I'm just saying traditional psychology. Traditional psychology models often focus on the development of autonomy and self-sufficiency. And so when you look at developmental psychology models, it's a lot of it is about more autonomy, more self-sufficiency, building capacity to function independently. And this model kind of flips that and says, actually, we're driven for relationships. We're driven for connection. And so when we have a psychology that says relationship is the driving force in our psychological mind and development, what ends up happening then is you can no longer avoid talking about power in psychology. So if you look at typical psychology theories, you very often do not see anything about power and dynamics of power. That shows up in some of the smaller subdisciplines within psychology, but in mainstream psychology, not a lot of conversation about power historically. But when you embed psychological development in the drive for connection, all relationships have dynamics of power embedded in them. And that's because all relationships have differing roles, have differing responsibilities. And when we're embedded, which we are, in an individualistic cultural context that has really driven, the culture is really driven by these concepts of autonomy and self-sufficiency, what we tend to do is differences in roles and responsibilities get ascribed differences in value. And when we ascribe differences in value in human roles, we then assign power to it. And so the differences in valuing based on roles and responsibility embeds power dynamics into all human relationships. So what does that mean? That means we can't ignore it in psychology anymore. We have to address power and disparities of power and abuses of power in relationships now. So relational cultural theory really taps into that. And then growth, development, and maturation in this model is a process of evolving relational awareness through as one navigates connections, disconnections, and reconnections, and develops increasingly complex networks of relationships. So, all relationships involve disconnection. Like there are no relationships that we have that at some point there isn't a disconnection. All of us, have conflicts with our spouses, conflicts with our kids, conflicts with our coworkers that create a relational disconnection. And so disconnection is normative. It's what happens. It's the reconnection that's a critical piece of this model, that we have to be able to navigate the reconnection process because disconnection is going to happen. We see it in infants when they're not getting their needs met. They cry from the disconnection. Kids on the playground work out their disconnections. Teens work out their disconnection with their group inclusion dynamics. All the drama of we were best friends and now we don't talk. And and young adults, as they're building intimate relationships with future spouses, there's connection and disconnection, and the ones that get married reconnect. So it's the process of learning how to navigate disconnection and reconnection that is the critical factor for growth and development in this model. All right. When we engage in the journey of this model of relational cultural theory and being driven for connection, and disconnection is going to happen, what happens is I'm not ready for that slide. Hold on. First, I want to talk about what happens when we connect. When we connect, we form growth fostering relationships. And so then we experience life with relationships of care, compassion, courage, conflict navigation skills, And we experience life with a zest for life, creativity, productivity, clarity, clear understanding of ourselves, others, and our relationships, and a sense of value for self and others, and a desire to continue to build connections, to grow more relationships. Central to healthy maturation in this model is mutuality. For us to develop those growth fostering relationships and the 5 good things of life, we have to be able to build mutually empathic, mutually empowered relationships where you find mutual responsiveness, respect, relational confidence, and mutual learning and growth. Jordan, who's like the main female author of this model, states that it's mutually empathic relationships, not power over others, that provide a sense of safety and motivation toward more connection. So mutuality is really at the core of this. And so we seek connection and we seek mutuality in that connection. But disconnection happens. And so disconnection causes fear and anxiety. So relational disconnection is a response to when we feel our safety, our connection being threatened, that our vulnerability is at risk of creating harm. And so we create disconnections. We disconnect as a form of self-protection. And so, and we do that. Patterns of disconnection across multiple relationships can develop into more of a generalized anxiety, distrust of relationships, especially in contexts that express dynamics of power and social stratification. Disconnection typically occurs when power over another is being exerted. So if you think about marital conflict, when we fight with our spouses, sometimes it's mutual effort to exert power over, and then you get, louder and louder and angrier and angrier. And then sometimes you may see spouses who, one gets really upset and you see more of a clear power over happening, right? Where they get very upset with the other and they may yell at the other or devalue the other, or diminish the other. And that is that exertion of power over in the face of disconnection. When we have lots of experiences with that, we may tend to have a pattern of distrusting power-based relationships. This is especially vulnerable when we don't have reconnection in relationships, when we don't have a pattern of reconnecting and working through power dynamics. As it relates to diversity then, so again, all relationships have power, all relationships have disconnection. We strive for reconnection and mutuality. As it relates to diversity capacity, the social dynamics of disconnection between centered and marginalized groups reinforces and perpetuates systemic and cultural patterns of mutual outgroup, distrust, devaluing, and isolation. So this pattern of power over, disconnection, distrust, non-reconnection has contributed to our ongoing challenge with creating diverse communities where marginalized and centered people are in healthy community together. All right. In relational cultural theory, how do we heal disconnections? We do it through reparation. And this is through working it through, coming back to the table and working through the disconnection to reconnect through mutuality, and to address the disconnection, division, devaluation that the power imbalances exerted and created. It's really important to know in this model, mutuality and equality are not the same thing. They're not the same thing. Mutuality can be established in relationships where individuals have distinct roles and responsibilities. So in a mutual relationship, each person's roles and responsibilities are valued, respected, and included. So I think about parent-child relationships, right? I have more responsibility as a parent than my children do to our relationship, to our household, to life in general. And so when we're engaged in mutuality, it doesn't mean that we're equally making decisions together, that we both have an equal voice in decisions. I'm the parent. I have a role and a responsibility to make hard decisions to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of my children, right? And so but we can still be engaged in mutuality by having that shared value, respect, and mutual inclusion in that relationship. So, so I think that's important because of that whole dialogue around what is equity, what is equality. In this model, it's about mutuality, that we have mutually value, respect, and include one another, regardless of our roles. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background from RCT. I want to talk a little bit about cultural humility. So that is a word that has been out for a while now, and so I won't spend too much time on it, except to say that it is really the foundation of developing relationships and communities that have restorative justice and that have reconciliation. And so Nelson Mandela says there's a universal respect and even admiration for those who are humble and simple by nature, and who have absolute confidence in all human beings, irrespective of their social status. And then in the letters to Philippians, says, do nothing by selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourself. But each of you look not to your own interest, but to the interest of the others. I think both of those really speak to what is humility, and cultural humility is essentially the idea of humility within the context of culture. And so Owen defined cultural humility in the context of counseling as a way of being where the therapist maintains an other-oriented perspective involving respect, lack of superiority, and attunement to the client's cultural heritage. So that can be extrapolated to cultural humility for everybody. And so I would argue you could describe cultural humility as the expression of several convergent perceptual orientations, ways of looking at the world. So one is to value and understand self and others from within one's cultural contexts, to not decontextualize people. Another way that cultural humility is expressed is through being open to others' perspectives, experiences, ideas, and willing to engage in critical self-reflection about one's own perspectives, ideas. And then valuing of others and acting on the desire to connect with and know diverse others, and to form mutual and power equitable relationships. So cultural humility works really well with relational cultural theory, and I think it works really well with a Christian model as well. And so I think that's an important underlying focus for expanding cultural capacity. Cultural humility helps us transition from a heritage cultural worldview to a broader, more multicultural worldview, where we can now better account for the expanded experience of the world as we encounter expanded experiences of the world. As we encounter people who experience the world differently, using cultural humility, we can begin to incorporate those larger pictures of the world into an expanded worldview. It also includes in that a ability to start to really look at the world through the lens of systems of stratification and our experiences, context within it. So those of us who sit in positions of higher on stratifications, we tend to be less aware of dynamics of stratification and systems of stratification. So when we engage in cultural humility and we start to expand our understanding of the world through our experiences with diverse others, we can start to see those things that maybe we weren't socialized to see. Our experiences haven't made us aware of. When people embody cultural humility, relationships are characterized by mutual openness, acceptance, flexibility, mindfulness, mutual sharing, transparency, authenticity, the ability to navigate disruptions and disconnections. So you can start to see these ideas kind of coming together. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump forward and talk a little bit about reconciliation and restoration. So reconciliation and restoration in this model are interdependent constructs. What that means is reconciliation is the idea of bringing people back into relationship after a disruption. It's that reconnection from RCT model. And restoration is the process of returning the relationship to wholeness. So they're dependent upon each other. For reconciliation to be authentic, restoration of the relationship has to occur. Otherwise, you have a pseudo connection. You don't have a reconnection. Relational cultural theory is very congruent with this idea of reconciliation and restoration. Christian faith, super congruent with this. Throughout Scripture, we see both reconciliation and restorative justice linked to both our personal and reconciled relationship with Christ. Christ gives us tons of examples, including the life of Christ himself, about engaging in reconciliation. Throughout the book of Acts, you see disruptions in relationships and reconciliation being practiced to bring the newly formed Christian community back into the wholeness. And then throughout Paul's letters, he's consistently having to address this with the newly formed Christian church. When we engage in reconciliation and restoration, we develop the ability to really live in deep valuing appreciation and affiliation with diverse others. We are able to experience healing and forgiveness, restoration with and transformation with Christ. I feel that this is both a interpersonal and a spiritual process, that when we're working on our relationship with Christ, we're working on our relationship with others. And so as we work through to reconciliation and restoration with others, we will be closer with Christ as well. And ultimately that will lead to restoration to justice in the community, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this project basically described in a couple of chapters the interpersonal and professional manifestations of how do we do reconciliation and restoration. Okay. And then restorative justice. So restorative justice is something we don't talk a lot about in psychology. So I had to really dig into the literature here. So in social sciences, most can agree that regardless of the type of justice orientation one's referring to, restorative justice involves mutually empowered humanity, equitably empowered agency, and systemic changes that enable equity in the access to tools of self-determination and to societal opportunities. It's an active process of creating mutual empowered, equitable relationships, contexts, systems, and society. So restorative justice occurs when individuals in a relationship or community respond to reparative needs in a manner that facilitates healing of both the harmed and the unharmed, promotes growth of all persons involved, and effectively diminishes injustices and disparities. Restorative justice in a Christian perspective is that spiritual practice that I just talked about. John Volnick, who is also a believer, one of the people we interviewed in South Africa, talked about as Christians, as we do interpersonal reconciliation and restoration, our injustices become a shared burden. Our challenges become their challenges, our weaknesses, their weaknesses. So that interpersonal reconciliation and restoration will incline us towards community reconciliation and restoration. Okay, again, these three things are all interdependent and interrelated. So the collaborative process of pursuing restorative justice relies on that interpersonal piece, and it relies on the communal piece. If we ignore dynamics of power, diversity, and injustice, which is what we often do when we don't have mutuality and equity in diverse relationships, we run the risk of reinforcing practices that promote disparities as opposed to promoting social justice. So Neville, this is talking about, and there's lots of work in this around restorative justice, around what is restorative justice, how is it practiced, and arguments that charitable and crisis relief efforts, those are relief efforts. Those are ways of relieving suffering. They're not restoring wholeness. They're not restoring to rightness. They're relieving suffering. So we can't confuse crisis or charitable relief with justice, with restoring justice. It's kind of like stopping the bleeding before we heal. Okay, Again, the interpersonal and the systemic are interrelated. As we pursue interpersonal, restorative, and reconciled relationships, we will go on journeys together towards restorative justice for the communities in which we're embedded. Because I want to get to the systemic, because that's the one that always gets ignored. I'll bypass a little bit here on interpersonal restorative justice. But it happens through those relationships of mutuality and working through those disconnections. Okay, one of the hardest things of this whole project is for me to get my knowledge and my understanding up around organizational and systemic restorative justice, because in my discipline, that hasn't been a main focus. So I wanted to share a little bit. Social systems are constructed by humans, sustained across time by hierarchical and intergenerational clusters of relationships within systems, which may be cemented in tangible ways like institutional goals and strategies, or in intangible ways like informal norms and expectations within the system. Therefore, the pursuit of systemic justice involves both interpersonal and organizational, community, and institutional processes. Efforts to pursue systemic justice in the absence of individual and interpersonal transformation will likely fail and produce ineffective, superficial changes. So that we see this sometimes when people become activists without alliances, right? So they go to the protests and they, the protest of the day, they go, they hold up their slides, they hold up their signs, they get upset, they post on social media, and then they go back to their life because they haven't engaged a community of allies who they're sharing the burden with, they're sharing the journey with. Likewise, efforts to pursue individual transformation and restoration of justice in interpersonal relationships without addressing systemic injustices will also likely fail and produce diverse relationships that lack true vulnerability, transparency, growth fostering relationship dynamics, and mutuality. Ultimately, if we don't make the transition from interpersonal to systemic injustices in our relationships, we will retain more superficial, collusive dynamics that maintains relational imbalances and fails to address injustices. So in the chapters on organizational and systemic restorative justice, readers will have the ability to deconstruct things like justice cognition, justice beliefs, and better understand how the diversity of ideology that underlies our differences around justice and restorative justice are our core piece of why we don't get to restorative justice together, because we have different ideas around justice. And then readers will have the opportunity to extend their skills to include practices of restorative justice collaboration, leadership, advocacy, and activism, learning how to facilitate institutional narrative deconstruction and epistemic and knowledge deconstruction. Readers would be equipped to take meaningful action to facilitate transformation toward inclusive justice of organizations and systems. So where am I at with this? Oh my goodness. So current status, growth, and challenges. This was such a great sabbatical. It was amazing. I loved it. Psychology as a discipline, as I mentioned, has largely avoided or marginalized discourses about justice and injustice. So this project pushed me to learn a whole new area of knowledge, which has been a great opportunity. And my current research is looking at this first one right now. We're looking at justice cognition and contingency justice cognition, which is part of justice theory. Looking at how we are so skilled at flipping our justice script when we become threatened, when our safety, security, our comfort becomes threatened. So doing some quantitative research with that right now. It introduced me to relational cultural theory, which was like, oh, yay, I found my home. And then it's allowing me to draw together different areas, subdisciplines within psychology that I have not done previously. In particular, justice and peace psychology was an area that I had not done much with prior to sabbatical. Additionally, my draft, hoping to get it done and get it to a Christian publisher, is faith integrated. And so, and I have so enjoyed doing faith integration on this project because it's definitely more of an integrated Christian theology into the work of diversity rather than a parallels model. It's an integrates model. And so, so it really is bringing these foundational shared ideas that we have in Christian theology and scripture with these foundational ideas in relational cultural theory, and really reconceptualizing how we talk about and how we pursue diversity and justice in ourselves and in our communities. So current status, I got about 4 or 5 chapters, about 60% written, maybe 70% written during my sabbatical, and about 90% outlined. And then I came back to APU, and we had a budget crisis, and then we had COVID. And so now what I need is non-crisis time to finish this project. So that is the project. Oh, after I got my goals for sabbatical done, my summer trip after the sabbatical was a family trip to Greece and Italy. So we spent 5 weeks exploring Europe in the summer, and kind of got out of my higher ed brain and tried to relax. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 10, 15 minutes for questions. So just go ahead and unmute yourself and or raise your hand and grab Kathryn's attention, and we'll go ahead and have time for question and answer. While you're thinking of your questions, I had one. As you were going through this, at points I had trouble distinguishing between how a person would relate to another person as an individual versus as a group, more of which cultural a cultural context implies more of a group kind of setting. Just want to mention that I had a little bit of questions around that. So maybe one specific question was, at one point about midway through, one of your slides says the key to identity transformation is cultural humility. Whose identity is being transformed here? And yeah, could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So as we expand our cultural capacity, as we build diverse mutual relationships and communities, our own identities get transformed. Mm-hmm. And so, identity development is part of life, right? We don't stop growing until we die. But cultural identity development is really tied to this process of engaging diverse others, working through disconnections, building relationships grounded in cultural humility, learning about each other. And none of us, I've got great relationships with some of the people here, and we don't always agree on everything, right? So there are times where we disagree, and we have to reconnect. We have to work that through, because we're friends and colleagues, and it's that process that then changes us. So that's one of the reasons why I mentioned to you, Don, that one of my greatest professional experiences is being with this group of faculty at APU, because it is, for the most part, a group of faculty who do this. We connect, we disagree, we work it through, and we reconnect. And that has caused us all to grow, and it deepens our relationships, more mutuality, more authenticity, but we are transformed in that process.
Okay.
Does that answer that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Kathryn, so many beautiful things in there, and I have to run in a minute. I have a doctor's appointment. I appreciate what you said about psychodynamic-oriented therapy, focusing on self-sufficiency rather than relational connectedness. That makes a lot of sense. But tied into that, I'm just wondering if we want mutuality and relational connectedness with everyone, and we kind of just move into this communal experience of embracing everyone. Do we not also simultaneously run the risk of just melding into the ego of the person in the group who has the most power, because I always think that there's a very, very strong desire or purpose for individuation within community, individuation within a collective group. Because if one is not individuated within a collective group, then the group tends to move in a particular direction based on the most powerful voice and the most powerful ego within the group. And so I think that self-proficiency within a collaborative environment where everybody is participating communally to relational connectedness, rather than a lack of focus on any self-proficiency, is probably seems to be more reasonable, that we do focus on self-sufficiency, but not for ego and pride or to hurt others, but to be one voice among many voices with some degree of self-sufficiency, so we can communicate to the larger group, using our particular skills and talents as individuated beings.
So I think in RCT, the antidote to that fear is authenticity, right? So part of this is authenticity. And if I'm being authentic, I'm not going to be Stephen. And if Stephen's being authentic, he's not going to be Kathryn, right? And so that authenticity and then the mutuality of the value of our differences is where we are able to avoid that dynamic of power over. But in this model, reconciliation doesn't happen when there's still that power over. And if one voice or one group is driving the train, so to speak, and leaving other voices out, you don't have authenticity or mutuality. So you don't have reconciliation.
Right. I guess in certain political climates, for example, if I want, relational connectedness with you, and I'm being evaluated based on a superficial characteristic of me, and you're being evaluated based on maybe some other superficial characteristic of you, then it seems to be there's a power differential where one of us may need to basically kind of take a more humble attitude than the other, because one of us is perceived as having more power than the other. And so the person perceived, even if it's through superficial characteristics, as having more power would need to, I guess, be more humble in light of perceptions that have nothing to do with reality, but have more to do with political climate of a particular time. So if I'm in a group of 8 people and I'm really trying to respect everybody in the group and establish relational connectedness with everyone in the group, and as I've shared before in conversations with you, if there are some people in the group that think I should spend 5 hours listening to their journey, but they only want to spend 1 minute listening to mine because of some monolithic characteristics that they throw onto me, then I don't feel that's really mutual relational connectedness.
Right.
And so I think that's important to me.
Yeah, and we weren't able to go into it because of time, but mutuality is experienced in the narrative sharing and in the exploring each other's experiences and understandings and perspectives, and not devaluing or marginalizing each other's experiences. Right. And that's in part of why I switched to this model, is because I think the old model really lends itself toward that. And I think this model of mutuality, authenticity, connection, and navigating disconnections is a better relational model for moving us towards that community transformation.
And maybe that's why I personally have enjoyed being in any kind of diversity conversations with you more than a lot of diversity conversations I've been in. So I want to thank you for the concept of cultural capacity instead of cultural competence. That means a lot to me. I've got to run. I got to get to the doctor.
Okay, take care, Stephen.
Okay, bye-bye.
I have a question on that note, Kathryn. When it comes to maybe engaging students with the concept of that shift, kind of not fully away, but from cultural competence to cultural humility, cultural capacity, and beginning a conversation with students who maybe haven't really encountered much at all of this conversation yet. How do you start? What would be your advice for how to just get started, get the ball rolling, and avoid putting anyone on the defensive like you've been speaking to?
So I'd say come to faculty meeting tomorrow, because that's gonna be the topic of our discussion tomorrow. But our department's been doing a year-long discourse around diversity in the classroom. So that's tomorrow's topic about how do we do this, engage it in the classroom. But you know, I think one of the things I really loved about John Jansen, who was the first Black president of a university in South Africa, is he speaks of this idea of entangled experience, that we lead from a position of entangled experience. We don't lead from, and that's cultural humility as well, right? We don't have all the answers. We don't know how to do this perfectly, but we can model interest, willing, that valuing, that authenticity, that respect, that mutuality, and invite students into that. And then tomorrow we'll talk about developmental ways to do that.
Wonderful.
Do we have just one final question? I would ask, maybe you said this at the beginning, but how did this work? How is it connected to your book? And it is, in other words, what you shared today, is it in your book, or you've extended it, or could you talk about that? Just say that again.
Yeah, so actually the book is actually built on the old model. The book came out just before we went to South Africa, and my whole way of thinking about this shifted.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So this is a new book.
Oh, so this is a whole new book. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I missed that. Yeah.
It's going to be shorter too. I'm setting a goal for like 200 pages. No more 500-page books.
So do you kind of disavow what you wrote in the other book then, or?
No, I don't, because I the way that I approach the other book, I think fits well with Christian undergraduates, and it lays things out very linearly. As I'm writing this book, I'm actually writing more to professional preparation level. So like grad students or teaching or business certificate kind of students. So it's at a little bit more advanced level that I think the developmental level, I used a developmental approach in the other book, and just was like, here's where you start, here's where you go. And so it's really kind of the beginning of the journey, step-by-step kind of process. Okay. And this one is going to be more of a psychotheological worldview, like personal belief system transformation approach. Does that? Yeah. Okay. Well, that's terrific. Thanks. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Well, thanks so much, Kathryn. Dr. Ecklund, sorry. Just as a token of our appreciation, my office has made plans to, or has gone ahead and made a small addition to a upcoming pay period for you. So you'll get a $100 stipend coming up. I know we're not supposed to use the word stipend these days, but anyway, it's something to that effect. And it'll be there in one time, but it's not a permanent thing. So don't be rebudgeting based on what you see there. But we really appreciate you, your good work in the department and in your scholarship, and the really wonderful presentation today. So thank you. And it was a great way to close out our academic year 2021 sabbatical presentations. And thanks everybody for coming and participating in this. Great seeing you all. Okay, bye-bye.